Hi, Ann.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing fine. How are you?
I can't complain. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and on audio podcast. You're Ann Hulbert. You're a literary editor at The Atlantic, former
That's right.
colleague of mine at The New Republic long ago, longer than either of us cares to remember, as they say. You're the author of a brand new book called Off the Charts, The Hidden Lives and Lessons of American Child Prodigies, which looks like this. For those of us my age, it's too late to use this as a how-to book. I don't think I can be a child prodigy at this point. But there may be parents out there who are wondering, what can they do? And we will... what's our promise? We can what? You can get any child into Harvard. What is the self-help promise of this book? And you can
Don't try to get your child into Harvard, because that way lies an unhappy childhood and a probably crisis-ridden adolescence.
Okay.
How's that for?
But there's more to the story than that.
But there's more to the story than that.
We should add.
Let
me add as your publicity advisor.
Right.
Let me just suggest that there's more to the
there's
story.
There's much more to that.
And
by not trying to get your kid into Harvard, you may succeed in getting your kid to Harvard.
Yeah.
That's the key.
So, yeah, you also wrote a book called, Raising America, about kind of the recent history of child rearing advice in America.
Yeah.
And then you wrote a biography of Gene Stafford, the writer.
I did.
All true. Called The Interior Castle.
That is correct.
But let's talk about this most recent book, which only came out a few weeks ago and has been very favorably reviewed. So, I mean, first of all, how did you decide you wanted to write about child prodigies? You have a couple of kids. They seem pretty prodigious to me. Were they
my inspiration?
Yeah.
No, I cannot say they were, though they are, fabulous children, of course. No, actually, Raising America, I think, was my inspiration in that, I wrote this book all about these experts who spent a century telling us that if we knew how to raise our children scientifically and accurately, we would unleash all sorts of new human potential. G. Stanley Hall, one of the first psychologists I write about, actually used the term super children. And yet I finished this book and I realized, I'd written all about adults and experts, but I hadn't actually written about children. And I'd written all about theory, but I hadn't really written about practice. And I thought, it would be really interesting to try to figure out a way to write about this aspiration to unleash all this potential by actually writing about kids. Mm-hmm. And prodigies have been of great interest in this country for roughly the same century that this expertise was of interest. So I thought, I'm going to go look into that. Mm-hmm. And that was sort of the germ of the book.
And I guess there was kind of a literature on it, right? There presumably...
Well, there's not really a literature on prodigies, I wouldn't say. There were many articles at the turn of the 20th century worrying about precocity, which was like this word that cropped up all over the place, and whether that was a good thing or a bad thing, and a big debate over trying sort of to rescue it from its ill repute and say early development was actually good. Mm-hmm. Which had not been the sort of traditional view of things. It was sort of early ripe, early rotten was the general view.
Wait, what's that phrase again?
Early ripe, early rotten.
Ah, I hadn't heard that.
Yeah. So...
The idea was that too much success would spoil them or something?
Well, or you'd exact nervous strain on the system by, having children do too much too soon, too fast. And they wouldn't be out playing and being children.
Right. Okay. So there were books on the...
There weren't really books about child prodigies. There were articles about precocious development. There was Louis Terman, who's the psychologist who brought us the Stanford-Binet test, who started this probably the most famous longitudinal study in the country, which was called Genetic Studies of Genius. And that was about young geniuses. He then decided genius was maybe not the right term, and those volumes came out sort of at a regular rate starting in the 1920s. So those were books sort of about prodigies. They were reporting on this group, this sample of high IQ kids that he had collected in California and then proceeded to watch throughout their lives. And then there have of late been a couple of good books trying to figure out how to think about prodigies, but I wouldn't say there's a really long tradition of writing about it.
And was there a big takeaway from that one seminal longitudinal study?
Well, I think the takeaway was basically, there were two things that Lewis Terman wanted to prove. A, that these high IQ kids were normal, healthy, wholesome, not weirdo, hyper-pressured kids. That was the first thing he wanted to prove. And the second thing he wanted to prove was that they would grow up to become wonderful, outstanding people. The first, he felt he basically did sort of prove that his selection was not exactly scientific. He tended to pick the children of attentive parents who were relatively well off, and indeed they were pretty healthy, wholesome children. Ultimately, I think he was a little disappointed in the outcomes, not because there were disastrous stories of failure, but just that there weren't really a lot of geniuses in his mix. In fact, very few. Which there were many perfectly successful people, but his great hope that if you identify them early, you will, have your Mozart and your Einstein, and because you will have seen them early, they will be even better than Mozart or Einstein were, though I think they were pretty good. So.
Okay. Now, one notable thing, so you look at basically, 15 child prodigies in the course of the book?
Yeah, I think actually it's probably 16, but yes.
Okay. Yeah. It's been misreported then.
I know.
And what's notable is some of them you've heard of. Shirley Temple, the chess champion Bobby Fischer. Norbert Wiener, I had definitely heard of. There maybe some people haven't. But then there are some you definitely haven't heard of. And what did you take away in terms of how likely child prodigiousness is to translate into, highly conspicuous career achievement?
My conclusion would be not necessarily likely, but I would also hasten to add that, this array of prodigies is by no means a sort of scientific sample. Part of the way I ended up picking the children I wanted to write about was I wanted to write about the social and cultural context in which these children grew up. And I wanted to write about the larger debates that they stirred up. So I was picking kids who were a cause of discussion in their time. Now, you could say to yourself...
They were famous child prodigies.
They were famous child prodigies, which you might say actually skews my sample in the wrong direction, which is that if you can be a non-famous child prodigy, you may be more likely to end up being a genius, for all I know. But I do think that's probably not.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost part of the connotation of the term child prodigy that they acquire some renown, right?
Definitely, though, yes. I mean, I think it's the rare child prodigy who doesn't attract, interest and stir up, kind of the ambivalent, wow, he's great, and ooh, should my kid be that great or not feeling. But I was picking ones who actually stirred up, larger debate than that, got people debating things in newspapers and raising larger questions about what these particular kids and their particular feats might tell us. And partly that was their parents consciously did that. I mean, Norbert Wiener, who is one of my first, and the child I pair him with, William James Sidis, both of their fathers at Harvard were very eager to make the claim that anybody can raise a child who can do the kinds of things that their boys could do extremely early. They were, extreme nurture proponents and, felt they had a really egalitarian message. They were Russian Jewish immigrants. They were kind of sticking it to the elite Boston WASP types and saying, look what our sons can do. We have a great technique anybody who isn't a lazy parent can do the same.
Okay. And Norbert Wiener is sometimes called the kind of the founder of cybernetics. There's actually significant achievement that he's kind of co-credited with having to do with information theory. The other, Claude Shannon kind of independently arrived at the same, at a key concept there. So he's a person of undoubted achievement. Now, the other guy we've never heard of, right? What was it, Sidus?
Yeah, I mean, you probably haven't heard of him unless maybe you've heard of him as the, object lesson in how terrible it is to be a child prodigy, because he ended up a recluse who collected streetcar transfers and was the subject of a really incredibly condescending and really terrible profile written in the New Yorker by the time he was grown up. So he's a kind of the cautionary tale writ large, I think, might be the only way you would have heard of him. And I do think that's unfair.
When was the New Yorker profile?
19, God, now you're going to...
Well, we're just roughly.
30.
Like which editor? William Shawn?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So
maybe it was Harold Ross, actually. It probably was.
Oh, okay.
I'm trying to think when, yeah.
Yeah. So that would have been a while ago. Well, how common is it that, at least in your experience, in your case studies, they do have kind of stage parents who seem intent from day one on making them people of great accomplishment?
Well, it's a really mixed bag, but I would say most of my stories have parents who are very invested in the early success of their children in different ways. I mean, for example, both, as I said, Norbert Wiener and William James Sidus's fathers in particular, were very invested in showing and making much of their children's early prowess. Henry Cowell, who grew up to be a very important American composer, his mother was utterly fascinated by her lovely child, but she was a great proponent of nature, not nurture, and she took great pains not to push and intrude, but in a way, of course, that's its own variety of intense focus, is to be writing a journal of everything your child does and bending over backwards to make sure that he has every opportunity to do whatever he wants to do. So in some sense, she's not at all a stage mother, but she is a very attentive, in her way, mother. And I would say Bobby Fischer is another sort of weird case in that he had a mother who was desperate to, get her asocial son doing something, pursued on his behalf his chess interest, only to realize, oh my God, I've got this complete obsessive now, and desperately tried to wean him of his total fixation on chess. And by that point, really, Bobby wanted to do everything that his mother didn't want him to do. So she ended up being very influential, but sort of reverse psychology, whatever she wanted.
She was willing to sacrifice his career for his psychological health, but she couldn't engineer it.
Yes.
And he's an interesting case because he was kind of famously crazy. I mean, even I remember as a kid, I was around 10 or 11 when it was him and I guess Boris Spassky was the big match. The Russian, this was during the Cold War, an American versus a Russian. And I remember, first of all, he was playing these head games with Spassky. He was like, no, I refuse to play today because the temperature's too whatever. And of course, he's famous for saying, the moment I play chess for is when I look across the board and see that my opponent's ego is crushed.
Right.
I guess a lot of questions are raised by him. I mean, first of all, how common is the kind of raw ambition that you hear in that quote, right? Whether it's a killer instinct or just ambition in a slightly less belligerent sense. How common did you find that in the kids themselves?
The sort of intense drive to be the best at something. He is absolutely, the kind of off the charts example. He and I think it was in many ways a kind of way of bringing order to his world too, but he was just incredibly competitive. And one teacher said, if he'd grown up next to a swimming pool, he would have been the world's greatest swimmer. So there's this sort of just raw, utter ambition, and also then persistence. Like he would practice hours and hours a day, and would, never stop no matter what his mother and others urged him to do. That kind of drive you do see in a lot of these kids, though it's not always clear to what extent it's very externally supported. I mean, another example is if you take Shirley Temple, and I write about her in relation to someone probably people haven't heard of, Philippa Schuyler, who is a biracial child who ended up being a composer who, very young, who was quite, she was definitely a remarkable child. Both of them were really hard workers. Shirley Temple, I think, would never have survived in Hollywood if she didn't have this kind of internal drive. And Philippa Schuyler was similar, but they had these mothers who were absolutely on the case all the time, too. So it becomes a little hard sometimes to disentangle where that kind of fierce drive comes from, I think.
So there are no examples in your book of just totally indifferent parents?
Totally indifferent parents, no, that's true. There really aren't. I mean, I would, I guess, go back. Maybe I misportrayed Henry Cowell's mother a little bit. She had so many of her own problems to deal with that there was plenty of time in which they were traveling across the country and they had no food and they were sort of crawling into bed and to stay under the covers because they had no heat. She wasn't worrying about how Henry was or wasn't thriving. So I guess she might qualify.
Okay. And I guess we've kind of hinted at your answer to this question, but I don't think we've heard it in so many words. It sounds like being a child prodigy is, in your view, not a ticket to happiness.
I think that is really right. I mean, I just think one of the things that reading about child prodigies reminds you of is the incredible power of expectations, both positive and negative. And it's very hard to have the one without the other. Once you've raised them, the chances that you might disappoint them are obviously there. And the more the expectations rise, the more the anxiety that you may not meet them, I think, keeps pace with it, even if you love what you're doing. And I guess I would say that there are definitely, Henry Cowell didn't care what anybody thought of him, I think, while he was a kid, which didn't mean that he didn't try to please. He lived in this sort of theosophical community and wrote music for various families and loved the fact that they loved it. But I think he wouldn't have been particularly crushed if they hadn't. So for him, having an audience was crucial, as it usually is, and having expectations was important. But I think he probably felt the least of the intense pressure of what might happen if he fell short. But
and
I think
he's a relatively good outcome. In other words, he achieved, he achieved great things and was a reasonably happy and fulfilled person.
He achieved great things. He had a very difficult life. He spent part of it in prison. So I think it would be,
not good.
That's not so fun.
What did he go to prison for?
For seducing a minor. So, and,
minor in the sense of, I guess we needn't get into it too much.
Yeah. But in prison, he, led the band. He became very involved in all kinds of things. He was a kind of undauntable guy who, when he looked back, he credited actually obstacles as sort of the key to his success. So,
Well, let me ask you this. Who do you think is like the best outcome of the 16?
That's a good question. I guess.
If you're
if I had to, just sort of.
Suppose you're the kind of parent you are. That's, I guess, the way you have to make this judgment, right? Yeah. And it's which child would you be most satisfied with?
I guess, at the risk of sounding I mean, so a couple of the computer prodigies I talk about who are now roughly my age, but they were, kind of on the cutting edge, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs generation, who were at Johns Hopkins, were rushed into college really early, who had at least one of them certainly had, I think, a difficult time. I think he's grown up. He has done very constructive things, though he hasn't yet fulfilled, he started a great business. I think he probably feels he has fallen short because his expectations were so high, but he has a family he never thought he would have. And I think is basically a person who has made a very good life for himself. I think Shirley Temple, she left what she did. She discovered her parents had, spent all her money. That could crush somebody. She went on. She became, a diplomat. She, I don't know that she was a star in her field once she left Hollywood, but she, I think, had a very rich and productive life, which I think is mostly what I would look for as the standard for my kids.
And then at the other end of the spectrum, who was the worst outcome?
I think the saddest story is the Philippa Schuyler story. I think the reason is she was so expressly the result of a parental agenda that was, she had a white mother and an African-American father, and her mother decided that her own life had been sort of eclipsed by an interracial marriage that at the time was completely, beyond the pale. And she ended up deciding that her daughter would be the proof of the power of hybrid vigor. And she just absolutely, to keep using all these metaphors, but orchestrated Philippa's life down to, every move. And in the end, I think isolated Philippa and put Philippa up against, a world that was racist enough that even had her mother done everything right, there was no way that Philippa was going to fulfill these aspirations, and managed to do it in a way that I think left Philippa feeling that no matter what she did, she was bound to be a disappointment. And then she happened to have the terrible luck of dying young in an airplane crash. And so you just feel as though you are kind of doomed by accident and also totally on purpose. And it just seemed to me truly tragic.
And is there another egregious outcome that comes to mind?
I mean, I do think William James Sidis's outcome was pretty sad. And again, it is really clueless parents who could have served him better, I think, much better. And Bobby Fischer's end is not exactly fun. But
every once in a while he would burst into the news again for various anti-Semitic diatribes or whatever. What was his? Now was he a born again Christian?
He was briefly a follower of a very weird religion. That was sort of a blend of Jewish and Christian views, and And
but how did he? What was the end of his life? He's no longer alive, right?
He is dead. Yes,
he's dead. And what was the kind of the end like? He achieved. People who were not alive during the Cold War may not be able to appreciate how on top of the world he was at one moment. He did defeat Boris Spassky, right? And that was the Cold War, and it was huge. Yeah. But then tell us about the rest of the story.
Well, he at that point began basically claiming that, the world was a conspiracy against him. He was just complete paranoid, and he disappeared and was homeless and got his teeth taken out because he really did leave.
Because he thought there were antennae in them or something?
Well, there's a bit of a dispute about the story, but he truly, lived on his mother's Social Security checks and wandered around and ended up traveling and, got to know why am I now suddenly drawing a blank on their names, the greatest woman chess player in her family, and became a kind of mentor to them. But he basically just really was unhinged, played a rematch, ended up in Yugoslavia during the Balkan Wars and spit on the United States edict that he shouldn't be there, was found in contempt, and then, was on the lam basically and died in Iceland.
Now, of course, chess, and this is one thing I was wondering, are some fields, do some fields make for unhappy prodigies more often than other fields, or maybe social misfits more often than other fields? I mean, chess is it's like, it's just not all that social a thing. And you can imagine people becoming great chess players and never develop anything in the way of social skills. Whereas if you're a musician, that's a little harder to do, right? I mean, especially if you're a composer, where part of the challenge is actual kind of, you might say orchestration, right? So is it, are some fields less conducive to being a happy prodigy than others?
I think I would hesitate to render an absolute verdict on that. I mean, the field of chess for youth is a completely different place than it was when Bobby Fischer was growing up. Then he was on his own. He would go over to his various mentors' houses. He would play in Washington Square Park, but there was no youth, scholastic chess world. And even if there had been, I don't think Bobby would have thrived in it. That was not his way. And when he did go to tournaments, he was more likely to have a fight than to mingle. Mm-hmm. But I think now the awareness of how much peer interaction is really important is much clearer to people. And certainly in the music world, an awareness of the prodigy predicament is one that's on the minds of a lot of people. And so summer camps and other occasions are expressly designed to try to counter. Yeah.
So high achieving kids are put in the company of other high achieving kids, so they'll have somebody they can relate to socially.
Right. And that was actually in the story I tell about the computer prodigies. The psychologist I read about, Julian Stanley, was the guy who basically brought us the Johns Hopkins talent search. And that the goal there was ultimately to create summer programs where kids who are more interested in academics and in speeding ahead than they're finding in their normal schools will find peers. And that's, I think has been a very positive development, is an awareness of how much kids do need other kids.
Yeah, I guess a kind of related question is, when they turn out like really not happy, how often is the problem that they just can't make it work socially?
I think that's a big part of the problem. And I think it's sometimes, almost always a big part of the problem. I think this sort of adolescent crisis that one scholar calls actually a midlife crisis for prodigies, because they've already been working for so many years by the time they hit adolescence, often is about a kind of newly self-aware assessment of what they do and why they do it, and do they want to continue it. But I think often what goes along with it is also a sense of, wait a minute, who's in charge of this, but also what world do I belong in? Because many of the prodigies I write about really had been either among adults or certainly not among their age mates for a lot of their childhood. And suddenly they need to be in a world of people who are roughly their age, and they have not a lot of practice. I think that is a real liability.
Now, the story of, is it pronounced Barbara Follett? Is that her?
Yeah.
That's kind of an interesting one.
Yeah, I found, I write about these two girls in the 1920s, one of whom was a poet and Barbara Follett was a novelist, but they were part of what was referred to at the time as this renaissance of creative girlhood. Adults were sort of fascinated by the imaginative gifts of children. It was sort of war-weary time, and the powers of childish wonder were sort of voyeuristically at center stage for adults. And Barbara was the daughter of two writers, one of them Wilson Follett, who actually wrote quite a bit for The Atlantic, and they introduced her to a typewriter really early, wanted her to find every avenue for self-expression by typing down all of her thoughts. She was homeschooled. She had a life mostly apart from peers, though she had lots of epistolary relationships with older people. She wrote letters on her typewriter and wrote lots of stories and ended up writing this novel, which she worked over endlessly with her father, who by that time was an editor at Knopf, and ended up having it published. And her life fell apart for reasons that I think, are and aren't correlated really with any generic story about prodigyhood. Her father, on whom she doted and who had been her great collaborator, ended up having an affair with his secretary and telling the family that he was leaving, at this pretty crucial phase for Barbara as she was an adolescent trying to figure out who she was anyway and how much she was on her own and how much she wasn't. And ended up it was the Depression. I mean, if you just sort of factor in all the social and familial circumstances she had to deal with, it's kind of daunting. And indeed, she really struggled, though in a way that I think brought her great pleasure in the course of it. She wanted to be an adventurer. She didn't want to go to college. She married young and went all over the place. And I think wrote constantly. She didn't publish, but she was continually writing. But she too ended up having a very unhappy marital drama and ended up disappearing, and no one ever heard from her again. She was 25.
They literally don't know where she went.
They don't. And I've just finished a really interesting memoir by someone else who got fascinated by Barbara Follett's story and spent way more time and energy than I did trying to figure out whether she could track her down. And I should give it away. But.
Okay. And she was a published novelist at what age?
12.
Yeah.
Now, and she's an interesting case. I mean, I wouldn't say that if you opened her book, House Without Windows, you would think that it was written by an adult. I don't think you would. However, it's incredibly well done. I mean, but it is a tale of a girl who runs away from her family and sort of turns into a fairy, and it's full of sort of the tropes of fairy infused literature, of which she read lots, and she loved Peter Pan, and you can see lots of influences at work. I think part of its appeal was that it was the product of a child's imagination. Mm-hmm. And that isn't so true of the poet with whom I pair her, whose initial poems, nobody knew they were written by a child.
Mm-hmm. So I don't think I've asked the question in so many words. We've been kind of talking about the answer in different ways. But when people say, so are prodigies born or made? Did I ask you that question?
No, you didn't actually ever put it.
What do you say?
I would say both, and in ways that probably don't quite track with what the question generally means. I mean, I do think you're born it in the sense that what family you end up in when, as much as what your particular talent, as well as your drive and how much drive is inborn versus also the product of these other circumstances. I'm not sure. So in that sense, I think it matters very much, birth. But I also think there is no prodigy, no matter how talented, for whom getting, the right guidance at the right time and doing a huge amount of work and practice isn't also crucial. Mm-hmm. So
now, strictly speaking, are prodigies born or made question isn't the question that's on the mind of parents everywhere. Strictly speaking, the question is, are children who get into the college I want my child to get into, or are children who become great doctors or whatever, are children who reach a considerable level of achievement born or made, right? Which is a little different from the quite a bit different from the prodigy question, but you do in the book get into the tiger mom question and Amy Chua, and that's more like the question she was addressing, right? And maybe you should remind people of, because it's been a few years since she created this stir with a book about so-called tiger moms.
Yeah, she wrote a memoir about raising her two daughters, not only to be sort of stellar students, but also to be sort of virtuosos, one on the piano and one on the violin. And so she did what parents who are eagerly trying to groom their children for the fast track, only more so. And her memoir was written more tongue-in-cheek or sort of more self-mocking than I think it was totally credited for being. She wrote the kind of expose that you would not find anywhere in the century preceding, of sort of saying, look, this is what I did. This is the kind of pushback I got from my kids. The story is that one of them went along and the other one said, forget it, Mom, I'm not doing this. And Amy Chua makes herself look terrible, and she knows she's making herself look terrible. So it is the sort of honesty that no parent in the preceding stories I tell would ever have copped to. Mm-hmm. So she, and in an odd way, I actually think Amy Chua is an odd example too, in that her kids probably could have gotten into any Ivy League school they chose because they had, legacy advantages at every single one of them, and they were great students, and so they didn't actually need to have their debut at Carnegie Hall on their instrument in order to seal the deal at all. And Amy Chua actually is sort of interesting in claiming that part of her motivation was actually to shake up entitled kids who might think that they had the red carpet rolled out for them and show them, you've got to really work hard, and to really excel at something is really hard. And I'm going to teach you sort of the against the grain lessons that go with it. Like, you can't just do everything that your peers do. You can't just sit around and enjoy yourself and be a, dopey teenager. You have to really work hard and be ready to be an unconventional person. And that's a lesson in our privileged cohort. It's easy not to learn. And I'm trying to teach my daughters that.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, the publicity surrounding her book did, as I recall, present her as an unabashed advocate of her child-rearing method. Am I oversimplifying what the publicity was like? Apparently, the publicity was oversimplifying the book, but wasn't that kind of the vibe?
Well, it was kind of the vibe, though I think it's probably sort of interesting that the vibe when she went on her China tour was the opposite, that she was greeted there as the mother who had revealed all the travails that go along with this, because there were so many parents there who felt they had sort of done a version of the same thing, and at last someone was airing, the slightly more complicated picture. And there certainly is the daughter who tells her mother, this was terrible and it was all about you, it wasn't about me. And in that sense, I don't think the daughters or Amy Chua at this point look back and say they regret it. And in fact, I think in a Slate piece recently, one of the daughter who did rebel sounds not full of resentment at all of her mother. So in that sense, I guess you're right. She is not second guessing herself in a truly deep way.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to talk a little more maybe about modern parenting in the context of aspirations of getting your child into elite colleges? Because, it seems to me that the colleges are really to blame for a certain amount of the obsessive. It seems to me that their criteria, which I think have evolved since I applied to college, I think increasingly at the elite universities, they're demanding a kind of child that can almost only be produced by obsessive parents. It's not impossible for it to happen, naturally or organically, you might say, but the students they hold up, as the ones they're so proud of having admitted. It seems to me their resumes the resumes of the kids could not have been the product of just kind of authentic native motivation, right? I mean, it just, they're just too implausible, all the stuff they've done and achieved. Is that crazy?
No, I totally agree. And I do think, to think of it as sort of a proto-prodigy approach is not wrong. It's the idea that, starting very early, you got to have your kid on this fast track, chalking up, one exploit after another, and that if you miss a step and they fall behind, you're in trouble. And yet you want to make sure they're well-rounded. So instead of letting them obsess about one particular thing, you make sure that they obsess about many particular things. And, and I think, I don't know, I do feel that when we were applying to college and being students, also the sort of demand that children be good at everything was much less intense. And I do think the instrumental view of childhood, which I guess is what I think is if you were going to kind of say what the recipe for helping a really talented young child is, somehow figuring out a way to make it plain to the child that this is their enterprise, it's not your enterprise, and it's not about doing it so that something in the future will happen. It's doing it because you want to be doing it. And I think one of the things kids do that and are better at than we are is getting truly involved in something for the sake of that thing and getting caught up in a process, not necessarily because of where it's leading, but because they're caught up in it. And I do think that this sort of college gauntlet approach is the antithesis of that. And it does kind of mean parents are thinking from the get-go, what am I doing? I'm trying to create a kid who in 12th grade is going to look like X. And that seems to me isn't really a useful way to help children feel that they are shaping their lives and figuring out what they're interested in.
Now, a couple of decades ago, I remember some parent told me they had a friend who, their 4-year-old child or however young, they were teaching him to fence, to be a fencer, because they had kind of figured okay, this is an obscure enough sport. You could create a state champion in this sport because there's not that many kids trying to do it.
Right.
And that's starting pretty young.
That is starting incredibly young. No, and
but it happens all the time. Now.
I know. I was going to say, I wish that I could say, that's not happening anymore. I mean, the child I write about at the end of the book, who now has just gone to college, I think, who is sort of a tiger parent, rage to master example of, he wanted to be a piano prodigy. But all along, his mother and he both talked about how much hard work it was, how much he did it because he wanted to be doing it. And I think some of it was true and much of it was true. And certainly the idea that if you talk about it in those more enlightened terms, it's better, was a reflection of where I think we've arrived, that we know the downsides. We sort of know how to talk about failure is important, performance isn't everything, a child should be able to exert some autonomy, parents should, but it's much easier said than done. We can say the right things, but when we realize that colleges are asking for these sort of complete virtuosi children, it's hard to resist.
Yeah. It is. And the other thing is you realize, even if, we worked pretty hard to not try to engineer college applicants, but then you realize, when they come home with a good grade or good feedback from a teacher, you're like, oh, that's so wonderful. You almost can't help. I mean, you're steering them so much more than you realize unless you really reflect on it. Not that there's anything wrong with making approving noises when kids do ostensibly good things. It's just that the cues are so subtle. I mean, and maybe this gets back to the book. I guess did you see an array of subtlety of parental guidance in that sense? I mean, some of the parents were very self-consciously trying to manufacture a prodigy. Some weren't, but were probably nonetheless exerting decisive influence, right?
Well, yes, I think in a way, the moral or whatever or lesson I draw is, parents are always worried that they aren't exerting the influence that they could. And I think that these stories, to me, one of their uses is to reveal to all of us how much, whether we think we're exerting influence or not, we really are.
Right.
It's just that we never quite know what that influence is. And that's the important thing to remember. It's what the child ends up perceiving as the influence that really matters. And the truth is, for all that we have a lot of power and control, we don't necessarily know. And you can do your best to be extremely subtle, but there's a whole lot about the lives of parents that children absorb, however subtle we may be.
Mm-hmm. Now, did you, I'm just curious kind of in closing about your attitude toward these various kids. Did you find yourself in one sense or another liking them all and having sympathy for them all, or were there some that were just kind of hard to like?
I actually really did end up liking them all and feeling, I think actually a sort of breakthrough in this book, which I found very difficult to write, was realizing that my goal, which I'm not saying I succeeded at achieving all along, was really to try to figure out their side of the story, and that I really genuinely wanted to do that because each of them seemed to me a really interesting kid. Mm-hmm. I would say, William James Sidis is the one who's hardest to, it's hard to get close to him because there's not that much to go on that is remotely firsthand, which is always the struggle when you're writing about children in history. They don't leave that many records, but no, I actually really did, and Philippa was hugely manipulative with her mother, but I was always thinking, you go girl, which is, feeling bad that she had to resort to what she had to resort to, but feeling pretty sympathetic.
Well, that leads to what may be the final question. What about the parents? Were you able to like all the parents, or was that often harder?
That was much harder, much, much harder. And in fact, I think, I ended up liking dimensions of some of the parents, but and sympathizing with their predicament, because I think it is, for all that we've, I think, emphasized how much the parents really do play a pretty driving role here. The kids with whom that works are themselves extremely driven, and that's not an easy kind of child to be a parent to. So I did feel sympathy, as well as a certain degree.
I wonder if part of the asymmetry of sympathy is that with the kids, you saw how they became what they were. That is conducive to sympathy, understanding the circumstances that led a person to behave the way they do. With the parents, you didn't really see that, right? They were just...
No, that's a good point.
They were just monsters out of the box.
Right. And you see enough of the things that they did that you think really were unconscionable that you end up feeling.
But there were some parents you liked, presumably.
Yeah. I really did like Henry Cowell's mother a lot. She's a sort of quirky, fascinating person, and Gertrude Temple in her way is kind of a trip too, and
Shirley Temple's
so and even Norbert Wiener's father had his sort of great side, a mushroom hunter full of interest in all kinds of things, a real poetic soul. He just also was a kind of bully. Mm-hmm. Two can go together, it turns out. So.
But as a rule, the more stage parentish, the harder you found it to like them?
Yes, I would say that's for sure.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So one take home for everyone is don't be a stage parent if you want Anne to like you. So the book is, and I think that's the question on most people's minds when you say how to make him like me.
Absolutely.
I've often been concerned with that. So the book is off the charts, The Hidden Lives and Lessons of American Child Prodigies by Anne Hulbert. It's brand new from the highly prestigious publisher, Knopf. Available at physical stores and in the ether alike. Thanks a lot, Anne, and good luck with the book.
Thank you, Bob. This was fun. Thank you.
Okay, take care.